Bob Temple, who helped revolutionize the ways medical products are developed and regulated, is retiring this week after more than 50 years at FDA. Along with a handful of colleagues, Temple created regulatory innovations that many in the biopharma industry take for granted today, such as blinded, controlled clinical trials with pre-specified endpoints and statistical analysis plans, the use of a single trial to support approval for some indications, among many others. He made critical decisions during the AIDS crisis by ushering in accelerated approval, a pathway that would go on to save countless lives. Washington editor Steve Usden takes a look at his legacy today on BioCentury This Week. Plus, forget the fast follower narrative, says our colleague Karen Tkach-Tuzman. Plenty of new target biology is now coming from Chinese university labs. Karen has a perspective on this. And takeaways on Novo's latest obesity trial from our man on the obesity beat, Stephen Hansen. I'm Jeff Cranmer, one of the executive editors here at BioCentury. And before we get into all this, I'm sure many of our listeners are gearing up to come down from the ski slopes and head out to San Francisco for JPM. BioCentury has a handy JPM guide. It's a one-stop shop for all of the events during JPM week, from sunup January 11th to sundown January 16th. And if you don't see an event, let us know. You can click the link at jpmguide.com to get access. Okay, Steve, you have been covering FDA for many years now. It feels like maybe 3 decades, and yet that's only about half the time that Bob Temple has been working at the agency, shaping how drugs are approved, are developed. I'd love to hear your insights on the impact of Bob.
Yeah, it's true. I've been doing this for a little bit more than 30 years. And when I started, Bob Temple had been there for a long time and was an institution. So it's actually going to be difficult to think about FDA without him. But you wrote a great story about his retirement. He really created the fundamental ideas that we take for granted today about how drugs are tested. I think that everything about him really was about a search for truth. How do you define the truth? How do you figure out what's true and what's not true? And then let that guide your activities. I heard once that Bob Temple, if he had the option, wouldn't cross the street unless he would prefer to have a double-blind controlled trial to determine whether it was proper to cross the street or to have a pastrami sandwich, if it was possible, But on the other hand, he wasn't rigid. He understood the essence of what the ideas were, what the purpose of clinical trials were, and because he understood what their purpose was, he wasn't dogmatic about it. So, for example, he introduced the idea first of pre-specifying what the statistical analysis was going to be before you did a trial, requiring a blinded controlled clinical trial. And he also introduced the idea of requiring 2 trials. After a while, though, it became clear that had become dogmatic. And what FDA reviewers were requiring, they were requiring companies to repeat the same trial twice and saying that they wouldn't approve something unless the same trial had been done twice and come out the same way. And Temple said, no, that's not really necessary. And then he led the transition to permitting companies in some circumstances to get a drug approved based on a single clinical trial, based on supporting evidence. He also, as you mentioned in your story, he created accelerated approval in response to the AIDS crisis. He also pioneered the idea of listening to patients. And I saw that once in a very dramatic way. So there was a drug for MS called Tysabri, which at the time was considered to be the most effective drug. And MS patients really believed that it was terribly important for them to have access to it. But it also it was responsible for creating a rare and 100% fatal condition called PML. And because of that, FDA took it off the market. There was an outcry from patients, and there was an advisory committee meeting that Temple presided over. I was there. It was very dramatic. And at that meeting, Temple basically said, look, we can't rule out the possibility that there's a 1 in 1,000 chance of a fatal event here, that people will die, that out of 1,000 people that take this therapy, one of them will die from this fatal disease. And the patient said, yeah, we understand that, and we're willing to accept that risk. And Temple bought into it. He said, okay, if you understand that that's what the risk, and that's in I remember him saying, me as a regulator and as a person who doesn't have this disease, I would never accept that level of risk. That's not something that would be acceptable. But if the patients understand it and they're willing to accept it, then okay, we'll approve it. And he did. So there were a lot of examples like that. I think that a lot of people in the industry believed that if they had difficulties with FDA reviewers who they believed didn't really understand the science or were being dogmatic, they could bring things to Bob Temple. And in some instances, if he agreed with them, then he would work with the reviewers and work with the FDA to get things to a place where patients would get access to the medicines that they need and deserve.
One
So
thing
it
that
was very
really
important.
surprised me, Steve, as I was researching this, as typically you would be writing this story, but you were off on one of your adventures that you take, and I'm so envious of. But I was happy I got to do this because I had no idea that when he joined FDA in the early 70s, FDA had been tasked by Congress in the wake of the thalidomide tragedy of the late 50s and 60s to you could only approve medicines if it benefited patients rather than just being safe. And when Temple joined, he basically said you would be horrified to see the clinical trial data submitted to the agency at the time. There was often no protocol at all. There was almost never a statistical plan. Sequential analyses were unheard of. He just said it was a completely different world. I spoke with one of your great contacts, Steve, Frank Saskanowski, who was in the room with Bob Temple when they were coming up with the idea of accelerated approval during the AIDS crisis. And Frank pointed out, when Bob was really getting going, it was him. There was only one office to approve drugs, and he was in charge of it. And Bob had to determine whether or not every new chemical entity was going to get approved, which is pretty amazing to think of compared with today.
Yeah, and he also had this kind of Herculean task, which was to figure out how to create a system to determine whether all of the things that had been approved prior to this modern era should stay on the market or not. And he created a system for doing that, and it was risk based and was really important. And again, it's to me the whole essence of what Bob Temple is that he created rigorous tests for scientific truth, and then he used those, and then he figured out ways to institutionalize those so that others could use them, and so that companies could understand what FDA standards were, where the goalposts were, and how to meet them. I find it difficult to believe that anyone else will ever have that kind of influence on FDA and on the regulation of medical products globally. So really, really, kind of the end of an era.
Yeah. So thanks, Bob. I think tomorrow's your last day at FDA, and it's really just mind-boggling all that you accomplish working with people like Janet Woodcock over the years. Many others have helped make FDA the way it is today. And speaking of FDA, Steve, before you set sail for your interesting destinations, you wrote an editor's commentary on the opportunities amid the chaos that is happening now in Washington, D.C. And I'm curious, what opportunities are there for FDA?
So taking a step back, basically what I think is if you look at the kind of the mission that the individuals who are going to be running HHS and FDA, the Office of Management and Budget, the Trump administration is going to have, they've assigned themselves a mission to be to enact radical change rapidly. And what I'm saying basically is that there are a lot of things to be worried about in that radical change, but there are also opportunities for positive change. And anybody who looks at FDA, anybody who's interacted with it, anybody who's worked there, can imagine things that could be changed and things that could be changed to make things much better for patients and much better for the companies that develop medicines for patients. My idea is to say, well, you can come up with a list of things that could be changed, some of them really big changes, some of them difficult ones, and you can package those as the kind of populist radical change that the Trump administration wants to make, and you could use this impetus to get some of those changes through the administration and possibly through Congress. The other side of the coin, though, is there are some of the big public health threats that have been talked about a lot, vaccines, for example. But there are also threats at the FDA itself. There's an animosity that's been expressed by several of the individuals who are likely to be in leadership positions in the Trump administration toward FDA user fees. And the thing about it is that if you don't have a deep knowledge of the way that user fees work, it's really easy to believe the rhetoric that comes from people who say that they're a form of corruption. You've got big pharma companies that are paying more than half of the cost for FDA to review drugs. And there's something that's called a negotiation between the industry and the FDA over the user fee goals and so on. And it's really easy to falsely portray this as a form of corruption. I think that it's highly unlikely that we're going to have a business as usual user fee renegotiation, which is supposed to start early in 2025. So that kind of epitomizes this threat and opportunity, right? I think that, everybody would say, okay, the best case would be that Congress would just step up and properly fund the FDA and industry's influence would be ended. The problem is that everyone knows also that Congress is not going to do that. They're not going to provide that kind of money to FDA. So I think that there's an opportunity here to recast user fees, one, to make it even more clear than it is now that there's an arm's length relationship between industry and FDA, that the money that industry is paying isn't corrupting FDA or influencing its decisions in any way. And I think there's also an opportunity to try to drive some kind of fundamental changes at FDA that would make its operations more efficient, more accountable, and more modern. And to use this opportunity now that we've got to do it, because just having a user fee renegotiation where we have kind of iterative change over what we've had in the past user fee negotiation, I think is not an option. I also think that it's going to be very difficult for the Trump administration to resist the urge to engage in brinksmanship here, because it will know that the consequences of not creating something that's similar to the user fee structure, to taking all of that money out of the system, would be catastrophic. It would be catastrophic for patients because drug reviews would slow to a crawl. It would be catastrophic for the companies that develop drugs, and it would be catastrophic for FDA because it would lose, half of its review staff or something like that. So it's very likely, I think, that the Trump administration will engage in some form of brinksmanship over this. What I think would be the best idea would be for industry and patients and academia and hopefully the new FDA commissioner to get together in advance and try to agree on a new structure, on a new way of doing things that will ensure that FDA can continue to function, that it receives the funding that it needs. If Congress is willing to step in and fill the gap, well, that's great. If not, industry should continue to do it, but it needs to be done in a way that creates confidence in the public that it's not corrupting FDA or influencing FDA's decisions.
All right, sounds good. Well, Steve's piece on finding opportunities amid chaos, I'll drop the link in the show notes. It's also at biocenturypodcast.com. We're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to come back, and Karen's going to clue us in on what's happening with innovation in Chinese universities and tell us a little bit about the Innovation Distillery, of which she is the curator. We'll also get into the latest in Novo's obesity trials.
BioCentury This Week is supported by the BioCentury Conference Series. For 3 decades, BioCentury has helped biopharma executives and investors make business-critical decisions and build larger networks with peers across the biopharma innovation ecosystem. Our goals are simple: gather the right people in the room to partner, network, and debate critical issues facing the biotech industry. BioCentury's upcoming events span the globe and feature topics from translation to company building to deal-making and investment. We hope to see you on the road at an upcoming BioCentury event. Visit biocenturyontheroad.com for more information and to register.
All right, we are back. Karen, welcome to the pod.
Thank you. Thank you.
Don't sleep on China's academic innovation. I always like a don't sleep headline. Some remarkable statistics in this story, which really jumped out at me. Just how China over the past 10 years has really caught up in terms of publishing papers in peer-reviewed journals and the like. Tell us what you found.
Sure. So this analysis and perspective is based on my work with BioCentury's Innovation Distillery. So as Jeff alluded to, our Innovation Distillery, which is a feature dating back to 2008, where we have been capturing papers from the academic literature with near-term translational impact. And what's really awesome is for the last 10 years of that, we've been able to capture all of those items, which were all kind of individual articles, back in our PDF days, et cetera, and get them into a database format, which is now part of BCIQ. So the Innovation Distillery is a module within the BCIQ database that you can click around and see some data analytics on. And, this is a slice of the translational universe, okay? There's way more papers out there than our team can sort of engage with, of course. But we focus on around 27 journals with high impact where we regularly see translational papers. And we distill from that papers where they're proposing either new target biology or new technology, going after perhaps existing targets, and where there's disease-modifying effects in preclinical models. That's kind of the core sort of factor for inclusion in the distillery these days. And looking at that, China has always been the second most prolific country in the distillery. Every year I've looked at it, going back, every year we have data. But it used to be a distant second, and that is definitely no longer the case. And this year is the first year that we really saw actually parity. I think there was one item of difference between the US and China in our innovation distillery. But, even when you look beyond what papers we actually choose to get in there, when we're doing our scanning, where we're discussing the articles and looking across it all, it's just so clear that every time you open a paper, you're like, oh, this is interesting. Very, very likely the principal investigators, which is how we assign country, right? Because you often have multi-university teams, but the principal investigators of papers are very likely to be from China, from Chinese universities. And one thing that is also really striking, because people tend to say, well, yes, of course, the Chinese biopharma ecosystem is really taken off in the last 10 years, 5 years, through regulatory innovations. And we're seeing, one of the things we've captured at the company level is China's tremendous ability to innovate on innovation. So taking those next gen modalities that are starting to, have success and then really running with them, bispecifics, ADCs, things of that nature. But what we're looking at in the distillery is earlier than that. This is preclinical in universities, generally without companies attached. And one of the things we do is we have been labeling whether a paper proposes a new target for a disease or proposes a new compound, perhaps against an existing target, or sometimes it does both. But what's really striking is that what we're seeing from the Chinese university labs isn't just, a better compound against a known target. It's really a lot of new targets. So recent examples include targeting macrophage lipid uptake through CD36 for preventing miscarriage, or increasing the activity of a de novo purine synthesis enzyme ADSS1 for myocardial infarction. And some interesting things also in the cardiometabolic space. And so it's just something where, we have this perspective series now where we're kind of sharing our opinions around things based on what we're seeing from where we sit. And what I just really wanted to tell the world was that Chinese university labs are really coming up with not just new sort of better compounds and all of that, but new target biology. And then the question becomes, who's going to translate that? How's that going to move forward? Because new target biology is, of course, sort of on the riskier end of things. And amid capital crunches like we and the China ecosystem and everyone is in, there is a tendency to reach for the safer, sort of known players, known targets, et cetera. But for those with the appetite to venture out, there is a lot of new target biology coming in these peer-reviewed journals from Chinese academic labs. So don't sleep on it.
Yep, and we do have, several, I know venture has been a bit quiet in China over the past couple of years, deep into its first bear market, but Qiming, Eight Roads, still very active, still chasing interesting science to build hot new companies around. And this stuff that Karen's talking about, it's what Qiming and Eight Roads and some of their Chinese counterparts are doing that really has inspired BioCentury to run several of its conferences in Asia. We have the BioCentury Bay Helix East-West Summit coming up in Singapore in early March. And then in the fall, we'll be having our 12th BioCentury Bay Helix China Healthcare Summit. We have the sort of companies that are translating these discoveries that Karen's talking about present at the conferences. I have the very fun job of selecting these companies. And if you are interested in presenting at either the East-West Summit or the China Healthcare Summit or some of our other conferences like BioEquity, where you'll find Stephen each year. This year it's in Belgium. And our newest conference, the Grand Rounds Conference. We, a couple of months ago, wrapped up the debut, which was in Nashville, and we'll have more for you soon on what is in store for Grand Rounds in 2025. But getting back to what you've been working on, Karen, you mentioned some kind of new bells and whistles with the Innovation Distillery. Can you break that down for us?
Yes. So back in 2022, we launched a sort of prototype version of what we then called the distillery dashboard. It was pulling together all of these individual distillery articles that we'd written, covering innovations back to 2014 and getting them into a database format. And it was available on our website, but it was in a prototype form. But this year we launched the Innovation Distillery, which is a true data analytics product that takes this information and makes it more workable, more usable, and puts it right alongside the rest of our data in our BCIQ database. So those of you who are BCIQ users, you know that there you have access to information on companies and deals and financings and all of that stuff in the commercial space. And then there is now also the Innovation Distillery module, as you can see on the top of the screen when you go. And that's where you have access to data around the preclinical early stage academic innovations that we're covering. So inching more of the early stage universe onto our BCIQ database. And one thing I also wanted to plug is that we have also now something that we're calling the Discovery and Translation Hub. So for those of you who remember the BioCentury Innovations days, that was when you could get in a separate publication all of our early stage discovery preclinical content. And while BioCentury is now all one thing, and we don't separate that out, for those who are looking specifically for early stage R&D, and that's what you're most excited to to read about, you would find all of those things nicely grouped together under our Discovery and Translation Hub page. So you could go to biocentury.com, and in the analysis menu, there's a Discovery and Translation link, or you could go biocentury.com/analysis/discovery and translation with little dashes in between. But that's where you'll get this perspective article I just wrote, but also deep dives such as our colleague Lauren Martz's work on KCC2 activation, nearing an inflection point, so getting into those mechanisms. The Science Spotlight reports headed by our colleague Danielle Golovin, who looks at platform innovations and company innovations from the literature every week, as well as the latest distillery items and podcasts and webcasts and things, everything related to discovery and translation.
All right, thanks for that, Karen. One of these days we should do the pod in the same room. It always feels odd to me that or maybe from the Groovy Goose, our local coffee shop here in the Bay Area that is sort of triangulates between your place and my place, not too far away. Who can resist a Groovy Goose? Especially they know how to do the cortado. So few people can do a proper cortado. For the true coffee nerds of San Francisco, Gibraltar, go figure. Or Italians like Steven Piccolo or something like that. Steven, you've been so quiet, waiting. You're sitting on a $150 billion market cap loss. That was the topic of your final story of the year. I know you're grateful that Novo didn't announce this data smack dab in the middle of your break.
True, that's true.
But wow, I just checked the stock chart and still down. Still or hasn't recovered, I should say. What happened here?
Yeah, so this was the sort of long-awaited data for CagriSema, which is Novo's combination of cagrilintide, which is an amylin agonist, and their semaglutide, the GLP-1. And yeah, a lot of hype here, I think, was the main thing. You know, basically the company and investors had kind of really built up expectations here. They were looking for 25% or more of weight loss in this study. And that's the thing, right? It's not as if it failed to show efficacy. It definitely works. This is definitely an active drug. It showed about 23% weight loss, which is about there was about 2% for a placebo. So it was about 20% placebo adjusted weight loss. But that was the problem, is that investors were expecting such a bigger one. They were basically expecting it to do much better than tirzepatide, Lilly's drug now marketed as Zepbound. And what it really showed was essentially data that makes it look as good as tirzepatide, but it did not best tirzepatide, which is what the expectation was. And so that's why, as you mentioned, I think it was pre-market where it was down about 150 billion. It did recover some during the day, so I think it ended up still losing, 85 billion is nothing to sniff your nose at. So a big hit for the company. And, I think the other issue was the fact that because they really only top-lined the data and there was no investor call, there was really no communication beyond the release. It just, leaves more questions that need to be answered really for this program. And, for me, I think there were kind of three that really kind of jumped out from this. First, what does the safety look like? Novo kind of alluded to the data kind of being in line with what you would expect for safety tolerability for GLP-1s. But I think there was some hope that an amylin combination would be more tolerable than others that include an incretin-based therapy. And so we kind of have to wait for the detailed data to see what happened there. But I kind of would have expected them to have highlighted, if the safety data had been better, I would have expected them to maybe call that out in the top line data. And so the fact that they didn't makes me kind of, I guess my working assumption is that it's maybe going to look similar to what we've seen from tirzepatide or the other therapies as well, which is not great for them in terms of positioning this commercial perspective. The other question that's going to come up is, was there a muscle sparing effect from this relative to Zepbound or some of the other incretin therapies? It's kind of been a growing sort of theme around amylin, is that you might get some muscle sparing effects because of the mechanism of amylin. But we don't know that. That again will have to be something that we'll have to see with the detailed data. And then finally, I think what this really does is it kind of heaps more pressure on some of the other phase 3 trials in this program. I think in particular, the Redefine 4 study, which is going to read out in the second half of next year. And that is a true head-to-head study of Zepbound, Lilly's Zepbound, and CagriSema. And the reason why I think that's going to be so important is because in this study, I think one of the contributing factors here was they had a flexible dosing protocol that essentially allowed patients to titrate up or down to whatever was the optimal dose for that individual. That's great from the patient perspective, but from a clinical trial conduct perspective, it meant that only 57% of patients actually reached the top dose. So you might not have been getting maximum efficacy being demonstrated in this trial. And so it then sort of raises the question, based on how Redefine 4 is designed, that has a dose escalation period for each treatment arm, and then patients go into a maintenance dose. And so the question that I think we need to get a good handle around is that same flexible dosing protocol included in the maintenance part of that trial, or are all patients titrated up to the high dose, which I think will give us a better sense of whether CagriSema can actually provide more weight loss than tirzepatide or not. So for me, it just leaves a bunch more questions that need to be answered for this program before people can have real confidence in it being a commercial success.
Interesting stuff, Stephen. Where does this leave Novo?
Where it leaves them is, I think, with a bit of a tough decision, right? Because it's obvious that CagriSema is an active drug. So they can push forward with trying to, run, obviously, and they're enrolling all the trials. So they can push forward with filing this, bringing this to market. But it's not the ideal setup, because CagriSema, it is a 2-drug combination. So it's a dual chamber, which makes it a tricky one from a fill finish kind of manufacturing perspective. It's not an ideal setup for that. Whereas the company also has amycretin in development. So it's in phase 1, but that is a unimolecular amylin and GLP-1 agonist, which makes it a bit more clean from a manufacturing perspective. And they are expecting phase 1 data for that molecule sometime in the coming year. Potentially could be in the first half of this year. And so that readout, I think, is really going to determine how fast they kind of push that forward, or kind of how much, money they put behind CagriSema. So that, I think, will be kind of interesting to see how that plays out. But I think it just really kind of ramps up kind of the pressure on getting that one right. So I think amycretin becomes all the much of a bigger potential molecule for them, kind of based on what we saw with this first trial.
Excellent. Well, if you're curious about who else is out there, what other pharmas are challenging Novo and Lilly in obesity, Stephen did a piece a few weeks back, and it's one of our top 12 stories of the year. We'll be publishing the best of BioCentury on Tuesday. So I'll drop a link to the best of BioCentury in the show notes, and you can check out what other stories were selected by Editor-in-Chief Simone Fishburne and myself as really the best of the best that Stephen and Lauren and Karen and Steve and our other writers put out this year. And this is our final podcast of 2024. We really are just so grateful for those of you who are making the pod a success by tuning in and liking us and pushing us up the podcast charts. That's always a good feeling for us. And so wishing you all a very happy new year and much success in 2025. New innovations, cool deals, big fundraisers. May your wildest biotech dreams come true. And thank you to Steve, and Karen for slipping out of bed on this late December day. And a hats off to our production guru, Alana Farrow, for joining us and making this sing today. We're also grateful to Kendall Square Orchestra, which is the outfit that provides the music for BioCentury this week. If you're not familiar with them, this Boston-based group connects science and technology professionals and other members of the greater Boston community to collaborate, innovate, and inspire through music while supporting causes related to healthcare and education. They do several programs throughout the year, so you can go to their website and see what's next. All right. Happy New Year, everyone.